Duchess Celeste Ashbourne had spent 10 years becoming a legend. In every corner of the kingdom, people spoke her name with admiration. Painters begged for permission to capture her likeness. Newspapers praised her wisdom. Young ladies copied her gowns, her mannerisms, even the way she carried her head when entering a ballroom. At 47, she remained the standard against which elegance was measured. No one ever mentioned loneliness. The vast Ashbourne Palace stood upon a hill overlooking the capital, its marble towers glowing silver beneath the morning sun. Servants hurried through polished corridors while messengers arrived carrying invitations from noble houses eager for her presence. Every day brought another banquet, another charity meeting, another gathering where her smile was expected and her composure admired. And every night the silence returned. Celeste often found herself wandering the palace long after midnight. The grand halls echoed beneath her footsteps. Portraits of ancestors watched from gilded frames. Crystal chandeliers hung motionless above empty rooms where laughter had long ago faded into memory. There had been a time when those halls felt alive. Before grief. Before widowhood. Before the kingdom had begun treating her less like a woman and more like a monument. She paused before a portrait of her late husband hanging above the fireplace in the western drawing room. The artist had captured him in the prime of his life, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed the future belonged to him. 10 years. 10 years since illness had stolen him. 10 years since she had learned that surviving was not the same as living. Her fingers brushed the frame. "You would laugh at how serious I've become," she whispered. The portrait, of course, offered no answer. By morning the Duchess was once again flawless. She attended council meetings, signed charitable grants, hosted visiting dignitaries, comforted widows, funded schools, solved disputes among neighboring estates. The kingdom adored her. Yet admiration could be its own prison. At a luncheon hosted by Lady Winthrop, Celeste sat among a circle of noble women discussing upcoming social events. Their compliments flowed as smoothly as the tea. "The Duchess grows more beautiful every year. Her grace is unmatched. She possesses such dignity." Celeste smiled politely. Then, believing she could not hear, one younger woman leaned toward another. "Thank heavens she no longer competes with us." A quiet laugh followed. "Romance belongs to younger women now." The words were softly spoken. They still landed like stones. Celeste continued sipping her tea without reacting. Years of experience had taught her how to hide wounds no one could see. When the luncheon ended, she returned home carrying that familiar ache. Not anger. Not bitterness. Only the quiet understanding that society had already written the final chapter of her story. She was respected, useful, admired, finished. 3 days later, the entire kingdom erupted with excitement. Duke Alexander Whitmore had returned. The news spread faster than wildfire. After years abroad, the young Duke came home covered in glory. Stories of his achievements filled every newspaper. He had commanded military campaigns, negotiated treaties, and survived dangers that sounded more like legends than facts. At 29, he possessed wealth, influence, and popularity rivaling men twice his age. Mothers dreamed of him marrying their daughters. Fathers dreamed of securing alliances with him. Young women practically fainted whenever his name appeared in conversation. The capital prepared for his arrival as if welcoming a conquering prince. Celeste listened to the endless discussions with detached amusement. She remembered Alexander before the fame. Before the titles carried such weight. Before the kingdom had fallen in love with him. She remembered a determined young man who asked impossible questions and never accepted easy answers. She had not seen him in years. She doubted he would remember her with the same affection. The following afternoon proved how wrong she was. A servant entered the library carrying visible excitement. "Your Grace, Duke Whitmore has arrived." Celeste looked up from her book. "So soon?" "He's asking for you." The words unsettled her more than they should have. She crossed the palace and entered the reception hall. Alexander stood beside the windows. For a moment neither spoke. Time seemed to collapse. He was taller than she remembered. Broader. Stronger. Confidence radiated from him as naturally as sunlight. Yet his eyes remained exactly the same, warm, intelligent, and impossible to intimidate. The instant he saw her, his entire face brightened. "There you are. Not your Grace. Not Duchess Ashbourne. There you are." As though finding her had been his true destination all along. Something unexpectedly fragile stirred inside her. The conversation that followed felt effortless. They spoke for hours without noticing the passage of time. Alexander recounted adventures abroad. Celeste shared stories from the kingdom. They laughed more than either expected. When evening arrived, neither seemed eager for the visit to end. After he finally departed, Celeste stood at the window watching his carriage disappear beyond the gates. For reasons she could not explain, the palace felt less empty. A week later, the royal palace hosted a magnificent ball celebrating Alexander's return. The event drew nobles from across the realm. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. Musicians filled the air with sweeping melodies. Silk gowns shimmered beneath golden candlelight. Every ambitious mother arrived with a daughter. Every daughter hoped for a dance. Alexander entered to thunderous applause. Within minutes he found himself surrounded by beautiful young women. Celeste watched from across the ballroom with quiet amusement. Then Alexander excused himself from every conversation. Ignoring dozens of hopeful admirers, he crossed the crowded floor. Straight toward her. Whispers immediately followed. He stopped before her and bowed. "May I have this dance?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Celeste should have refused. She knew that. Instead she placed her hand in his. The orchestra began playing. They moved together across the ballroom with effortless harmony. Every step felt natural. Every glance carried unspoken understanding. Years vanished between them. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Celeste stopped feeling like a widow. Stopped feeling like a symbol. Stopped feeling old. She simply felt alive. And Alexander looked at her as though she were the most extraordinary woman in the room. Long after the music ended, the whispers remained. The next morning, newspapers appeared throughout the kingdom. Servants carried one into the breakfast room and placed it beside her tea. Celeste unfolded the paper. Her heartbeat slowed. Across the front page, printed in enormous letters, stood a headline already spreading through every city, village, and noble estate in the realm. Young Duke pursues aging Duchess. And for the first time since Alexander Whitmore had returned home, fear entered her heart. Before the week ended, the headline had spread across the entire kingdom. Copies of the newspaper appeared in drawing rooms, cafes, government offices, and palace corridors. Aristocrats discussed it over expensive wine. Merchants repeated it across market squares. Even servants whispered about it while polishing silver or tending gardens. The story fascinated everyone. A young duke. An older duchess. A romance society had never approved. Duchess Celeste Ashbourne quickly discovered that admiration could transform into cruelty overnight. Where once people praised her grace, they now questioned her motives. Where once they celebrated her wisdom, they now mocked her desires. The shift happened so subtly that it almost felt unreal. At charity functions, conversations stopped when she approached. At dinners, smiles appeared a fraction too late. Every compliment carried a hidden edge. "You look wonderful, Your Grace. For your age. We are delighted to see you." Despite the scandal, the unspoken words hurt far more than the spoken ones. Celeste endured them all with the same composure that had carried her through widowhood. No one saw how exhausted she became afterward. One afternoon she sat alone in her private sitting room overlooking the palace gardens. Rain tapped softly against the windows while newspapers lay scattered across a nearby table. Each carried a different version of the same story. Some called her manipulative. Others called her desperate. One particularly cruel article suggested she was clinging to fading beauty because she feared becoming irrelevant. Celeste folded the paper and placed it aside. She refused to cry. Not because the words failed to wound her. Because she was tired of giving pain the satisfaction. Meanwhile, the kingdom launched an entirely different campaign against Alexander Whitmore. The young duke suddenly became the most desired bachelor in the realm. Every ambitious family saw opportunity. Invitations flooded his residence. Ballrooms conveniently arranged guest lists around his attendants. Young noblewomen appeared wherever he happened to be. Some were breathtakingly beautiful. Others possessed enormous fortunes. Many carried the blessings of powerful parents eager for an alliance. Alexander ignored nearly all of them. That only made them try harder. At one royal banquet, a countess spent an entire evening positioning her daughter beside him. The young woman possessed flawless features and a charming smile. Alexander listened politely while she described her interests. Then he excused himself halfway through the conversation. Moments later he was seated beside Celeste discussing literature. The countess nearly choked on her wine. Stories like that spread quickly. Soon the kingdom's most influential families began intervening directly. Several powerful dukes requested private meetings with Alexander. Advisors reminded him of his future responsibilities. Political allies warned him that public affection for Celeste could damage important negotiations. One elderly statesman finally voiced what many secretly believed. History rewards wise marriages, not emotional ones. Alexander smiled. Then history must be very disappointed in me. The remark circulated through society by morning. The scandal only intensified. What surprised Celeste most was Alexander's complete refusal to retreat. Instead of distancing himself, he seemed determined to become more present. He visited her estate regularly. Sometimes for formal reasons. Usually for no reason at all. The palace that had once felt empty gradually filled with laughter. One crisp autumn morning, Alexander convinced her to leave official duties behind and join him on horseback. Golden leaves covered the forest paths beyond the capital. Sunlight filtered through branches painted in shades of amber and fire. They rode side by side beneath the canopy. For the first hour they discussed politics. For the second they discussed books. By the third they had abandoned serious topics entirely. Alexander attempted to jump a narrow stream and nearly landed in the water. Celeste laughed so unexpectedly that her horse startled beneath her. The sound echoed through the forest. Bright, unrestrained, alive. Alexander stared at her with obvious satisfaction. There she is. There who is. The woman everyone forgot existed beneath the title. The observation lingered with her long after they returned home. A week later he challenged her to chess. The match lasted 40 minutes. Celeste won. The following evening he demanded a rematch. She won again. 3 days later he returned carrying a new strategy and excessive confidence. She defeated him even faster. "You're impossible," he complained. "No," she replied. "You're predictable." His grin widened. She eventually realized he enjoyed losing. It gave him an excuse to keep coming back. Winter arrived quietly. Snow covered rooftops and transformed the kingdom into silver and white. One evening Alexander appeared outside her palace carrying an outrageous amount of enthusiasm. Before she understood his intentions, he had dragged her into the gardens. The snowfall drifted gently around them. Children from nearby villages played in distant fields. Alexander began constructing what he insisted was a magnificent snow sculpture. It looked more like a collapsed horse. Celeste laughed so hard she could barely remain standing. Years seemed to dissolve beneath the falling snow. For those moments, grief lost its grip. Age lost its power. Only happiness remained. Yet their most treasured day arrived unexpectedly during a village fair several weeks later. Disguised beneath simple traveling clothes, they ventured beyond the capital. No servants accompanied them. No titles followed them. Nobody recognized them. They wandered between colorful stalls overflowing with handmade goods. Musicians performed lively melodies near the town square. Children chased one another between lanterns strung overhead. Alexander purchased roasted chestnuts. Celeste bought ribbons she did not need. They watched puppet shows, shared sweets, listened to stories told by wandering performers. For one perfect day they belonged to no one except themselves. As evening approached, they sat beside a small river illuminated by hundreds of floating lanterns. The water reflected golden light across Celeste's face. Alexander watched her quietly. Not as a duchess. Not as a symbol. As a woman. And somewhere during that peaceful silence, he realized the truth he could no longer escape. He loved her. Not because she was admired. Not because she was beautiful. Not because the kingdom respected her. He loved her because she made every place feel brighter simply by existing. The realization frightened him less than losing her. Unfortunately, the kingdom was determined to make certain he did. The cruelty reached its peak during a grand winter gathering hosted by one of the capital's wealthiest families. Celeste arrived alone. Music filled the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished floors. For a while everything seemed ordinary. Then she stepped onto a quiet balcony seeking fresh air. Voices drifted from the shadows nearby. A group of young noblewomen stood hidden beyond the doorway. They had not seen her. One laughed softly. "He may be fascinated now." Another shrugged. "Men grow bored eventually." A third voice answered. "Especially when youth is waiting everywhere." Laughter followed. Then came the sentence she would remember forever. "He will realize soon enough that she is nothing but a burden he feels guilty abandoning." The women continued speaking. Celeste heard nothing else. The word struck with devastating precision. Burden. The single word echoed through every fear she had struggled to suppress. Standing alone beneath the winter stars, she suddenly wondered whether the kingdom saw something she refused to see. And for the first time since Alexander had brought happiness back into her life, doubt quietly entered her heart. The word burden followed Celeste Ashbourne home. It lingered in the silence of her carriage. It waited in the shadows of her palace corridors. It sat beside her during meals and stood beside her bed at night. Burden. A simple word spoken by strangers who knew nothing about her life, yet it carried the weight of every fear she had spent years suppressing. For weeks she tried to ignore it. She told herself society was cruel. She told herself gossip always found a target. She told herself Alexander Whitmore was strong enough to make his own decisions. Yet doubt had already planted its roots. Every newspaper article became another reminder. Every whispered conversation became another wound. Every hopeful look in Alexander's eyes became another reason to question whether she had the right to keep him beside her. One rainy evening she stood alone in the palace library while thunder rolled beyond the windows. Alexander had left only an hour earlier. His laughter still seemed to linger among the bookshelves. A chessboard remained between two empty chairs. He had lost again. Deliberately, she suspected. A smile briefly touched her lips. Then it vanished. She imagined his future stretching before him. Power, influence, marriage, children. An entire lifetime still waiting to be lived. And standing beside that future was her own reflection. A widow approaching 50. A woman whose greatest adventures belonged to the past. A woman the kingdom had already begun calling old. For the first time she wondered whether love could become selfish. The answer broke her heart. 3 days later she disappeared. No farewell banquet. No dramatic announcement. No explanation. Before dawn, a small carriage departed through the eastern gates of Ashbourne Palace. Only 2 servants accompanied her. By the time the capital awakened, Duchess Celeste Ashbourne was gone. She traveled for days. Far beyond the busy cities. Far beyond the estates of powerful nobles. Far beyond the places where Alexander might naturally search. Her destination was an isolated manor overlooking a rugged coastline where cliffs met restless gray seas. The house stood alone against the wind. Waves crashed endlessly against the rocks below. Salt filled the air. The horizon stretched forever. It was exactly the kind of place where memories could not easily follow. Unfortunately, memories ignored geography. Every room reminded her of him. Every sunset reminded her of him. Every quiet moment became an opportunity to miss him. Meanwhile, chaos erupted in the capital. Alexander learned of her departure shortly after sunrise. At first he assumed she would return within days. Then days became weeks. Weeks became months. Panic slowly replaced certainty. He searched everywhere. He questioned servants. Visited estates. Spoke with merchants. Followed rumors. Rode through villages. Offered rewards for information. Nothing brought him closer to finding her. The kingdom watched its celebrated duke transform before their eyes. The easy laughter disappeared first. Then his patience. Then the warmth that once made people gravitate toward him. A quiet distance settled over him. Even victory seemed unable to reach him anymore. One autumn storm found him standing outside the gates of Ashbourne Palace long after midnight. Rain drenched his coat. Lightning illuminated the empty windows above. The gardens where they had once walked together stood abandoned beneath the storm. Alexander remained there for hours, as if refusing to accept that she was truly gone. Eventually he began writing. The first letter arrived at the coastal manor 2 weeks after her departure. Celeste recognized the handwriting instantly. Her fingers trembled. She almost opened it. Almost. Instead she placed it inside a desk drawer. The second letter arrived 3 days later. Then another. Then another. Soon they appeared nearly every morning. Some were brief. Some were several pages long. Some carried visible signs of frustration. Others seemed painfully vulnerable. She opened none of them. Weeks passed. The drawer became full. She moved the letters to a larger compartment. Months later, entire sections of her desk overflowed with unopened envelopes. Stacks rose like silent monuments to a love she refused to acknowledge. Yet every evening she touched them. Every evening she wondered what they contained. And every evening she lacked the courage to find out. Winter arrived. The sea grew harsher. Storms battered the cliffs with relentless force. One particularly cold morning Celeste visited a small chapel overlooking the shoreline. The building was ancient and weather-worn. Colored glass windows painted the stone floor with soft fragments of light. She knelt in silence, not praying for herself, praying for him, praying that happiness would eventually find him even if she could not. Then she left before noon. What she never knew was that Alexander visited the very same chapel. Not on Mondays. On Fridays. He would arrive after long journeys, kneel beneath the same stained glass window and remain there for hours. Neither knew of the other's presence. Neither knew they continued sharing the same sanctuary. Separated by days. United by longing. The irony would have been almost cruel if it were not so tragic. By spring, society decided the romance had ended. New scandals replaced old ones. New headlines appeared. New gossip circulated. The kingdom moved forward. Only Alexander seemed unable to follow. Powerful families once again introduced daughters to him. He attended the necessary functions. Smiled when required. Spoke when expected. Yet something essential had gone missing. People noticed. Some described him as colder. Others called him distant. A few whispered that heartbreak had accomplished what politics never could. It had humbled him. Months after her departure, Celeste finally allowed herself to read the newspapers again. That was how she learned the news. The announcement occupied nearly every front page. Royal seals accompanied the proclamation. Crowds celebrated throughout the capital. Alexander Whitmore had been selected as the next Lord Protector of the kingdom, the highest honor available to any nobleman. A position of extraordinary authority. A position many believed would eventually lead him to even greater power. According to the articles, a formal coronation celebration would soon take place. One additional sentence appeared in nearly every report. Tradition expected the new Lord Protector to announce a bride. Celeste stared at those words until the ink blurred. For several minutes she could not breathe. Outside, waves crashed violently against the cliffs. Inside, silence filled the room. Slowly her gaze drifted toward the mountain of unopened letters occupying nearly half the desk. For months she had convinced herself she was protecting his future. Now that future seemed ready to begin without her. And for the first time since leaving him behind, Duchess Celeste Ashbourne wondered whether the sacrifice had broken only one heart, or two. The journey back to the capital felt longer than the one that had taken Celeste away. Each mile brought her closer to a future she no longer believed belonged to her. Spring had returned to the kingdom. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. Rivers glittered beneath warm sunlight. Villages bustled with celebration as preparations for the coronation filled every corner of the realm. None of the beauty reached her. She sat quietly inside her carriage, watching the world pass beyond the window while her heart remained fixed upon a single thought. Alexander was moving forward. At last, he was becoming the man destiny had always intended him to be. And she had come only to say goodbye. The capital appeared on the horizon shortly before sunset. Its towers gleamed gold beneath the fading light. Banners bearing Alexander Whitmore's crest hung from nearly every building. Crowds filled the streets. Musicians performed in public squares. Merchants sold commemorative ribbons and portraits celebrating the kingdom's future Lord Protector. The entire city seemed intoxicated by hope. Celeste felt strangely invisible among it all. Her arrival attracted attention, but far less than it once would have. Society had already decided her story was finished. For once she found comfort in that. The coronation celebration began the following evening. The royal palace blazed with extraordinary splendor. Thousands of candles illuminated marble corridors. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like constellations suspended above the grand ballroom. Noble families arrived in magnificent carriages while military officers, foreign dignitaries, and royal guests filled every available space. The event felt less like a celebration and more like history unfolding in real time. Celeste entered quietly. Despite months away, whispers immediately followed her. Not cruel whispers this time. Curious ones. Surprised ones. Many had assumed she would never return. She ignored them. Her eyes searched only for one person. She found him near the center of the ballroom. For a moment she forgot how to breathe. Alexander stood surrounded by noblemen, military leaders, and royal advisors. Confidence radiated from him. His dark formal attire carried the insignia of his future office. Applause seemed to follow wherever he moved. The kingdom saw power. She saw loneliness. Even from a distance she recognized it. Then she noticed the women. Young women. Beautiful women. They surrounded him constantly. One laughed at something he said. Another touched his arm. A third stood close enough to suggest familiarity. All of them represented futures society considered appropriate. Futures she could never provide. The sight struck harder than she expected. Months earlier she had left to protect him from sacrifice. Now she was forced to witness the life that sacrifice had created. A sharp ache settled inside her chest. For the remainder of the evening she drifted through conversations without truly hearing them. People spoke. Music played. Laughter echoed. Everything felt distant. Her gaze returned to Alexander again and again. Sometimes he appeared engaged in discussion. Sometimes he looked distracted. Twice she caught him scanning the crowd. Both times she looked away before he could see her. The night progressed. The announcement ceremony approached. Soon he would reveal his future. Soon she would leave. Forever. The realization settled over her with devastating certainty. When the orchestra paused between performances, Celeste quietly slipped away. She crossed silent corridors and climbed a staircase leading toward the upper terraces of the palace. Few guests ventured there. The balcony overlooked the entire capital. Thousands of lanterns illuminated the city below. Rivers of golden light stretched through the streets. Bells rang in distant towers. The kingdom celebrated. The woman who loved its future protector stood alone. Cool wind brushed her silver-streaked hair. For several peaceful minutes she allowed herself to grieve. Not for what had happened. For what might have been. Footsteps interrupted the silence. She knew who it was before turning. Alexander stood in the doorway. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Months of longing filled the space between them. His expression hardened. Not with anger. With hurt. Profound, unmistakable hurt. You left. The words emerged quietly. They somehow carried more pain than any accusation. Celeste lowered her eyes. I know. No explanation. She remained silent. No letter. The guilt deepened. No goodbye. I thought it was necessary. His laugh contained no amusement. You thought. The words hung between them. Alexander stepped closer. For the first time she noticed how exhausted he looked. The shadows beneath his eyes. The tension he carried. The invisible scars of months spent searching. You decided what was best for me without asking me. Tears threatened. She fought them back. I was trying to protect you. From what? The answer came immediately. From me. Silence followed. The city lights shimmered below. Neither seemed capable of looking away. Finally Celeste spoke the truth she had carried for months. The kingdom was right. His expression darkened. No. It was. She forced herself to continue. Every word felt like tearing open an old wound. You deserve a future. I have one. You deserve children. His jaw tightened. You deserve happiness. I know where my happiness is. The certainty in his voice nearly destroyed her resolve. She looked away before she surrendered completely. Then, because honesty had already begun, she continued, I love you. The confession emerged softer than a whisper. Alexander froze. The world seemed to stop. Music no longer reached them. When no longer mattered. Only those 3 words remained. Tears finally escaped her control. I have loved you longer than I should. She smiled sadly. Which is precisely why I have to let you go. Alexander said nothing. His silence frightened her more than anger ever could. She drew a shaky breath. Then she delivered the sentence that had haunted her for months. You're too young for an old duchess. The words sounded cruel. Not because they were false. Because she wanted them to be false. She continued before he could interrupt. You deserve someone who can walk beside you for decades. A tear slid down her cheek. You deserve a wife closer to your age. Another followed. You deserve everything I can no longer give. The vulnerability in her voice shattered the final barriers protecting her heart. For the first time she allowed him to see every insecurity, every fear, every wound society had inflicted. When she finished, neither spoke. The city stretched endlessly beneath them. The future waited beyond the ballroom. And somewhere within that silence, Celeste convinced herself she had finally done the right thing. She turned toward the doorway, toward goodbye, toward exile, toward a life without him. Each step felt heavier than the last. She had almost reached the corridor when a hand closed firmly around hers. Warm, certain, unwilling to let go. Celeste stopped. Slowly she looked back. Alexander stood behind her, his eyes shining with fierce determination. Without speaking, he intertwined his fingers with hers. Then he began leading her toward the grand staircase, toward the music, toward the crowd, toward the thousands of nobles waiting below. And as realization dawned, Celeste understood with sudden terror that Alexander Whitmore was not taking her away from the kingdom. He was taking her directly into its judgment. The grand staircase seemed endless. Every step Alexander Whitmore took echoed through the palace like a declaration of war. Beside him, Celeste struggled to understand what he intended. Fear twisted inside her chest as they descended toward the ballroom. Thousands of nobles waited below. Politicians waited below. Foreign dignitaries waited below. The entire kingdom waited below. and Alexander was leading her directly into the center of it. The music faltered first. Conversations followed. By the time they reached the ballroom floor, silence had begun spreading through the crowd. Heads turned. Fans stopped moving. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Nobody failed to notice the future Lord Protector entering hand in hand with the woman society had spent months trying to erase from his future. Alexander never released her. Not for a second. The orchestra looked uncertain. The king himself watched with visible curiosity. Every eye followed them toward the center of the room. "Alexander," Celeste whispered urgently. "Please." He looked at her. For the first time that evening, she saw peace in his expression. Not uncertainty. Not hesitation. The kind possessed by a man who had finally stopped running from his own heart. "You left because you thought you were protecting me," he said quietly. The crowd strained to hear. "You spent months sacrificing your happiness because you believed I deserved better." His voice carried through the ballroom. People began exchanging confused glances. Celeste felt tears gathering again. "Please don't do this. I'm finally doing exactly what I should have done months ago." He stepped forward. The orchestra conductor lowered his baton. The room became completely silent. Alexander turned to face the kingdom. For years he had commanded armies, negotiated treaties, faced danger without flinching. Yet nothing had ever mattered more than the next few moments. His gaze swept across the crowd. Then he spoke. "You have all spent months discussing my future. No one moved. You have offered advice. Several noblemen shifted uncomfortably. You have offered warnings. More silence. You have offered criticism. A few faces reddened. And many of you have decided what kind of woman deserves my love." The tension became almost unbearable. Alexander looked toward Celeste. The tenderness in his eyes stole her breath. When he spoke again, every word carried absolute conviction. "Tonight I would like to correct a misunderstanding." Slowly he turned back toward the crowd. Then, before anyone could predict his intentions, he lifted Celeste into his arms. Gasps exploded throughout the ballroom. Several women covered their mouths. Others stared in complete disbelief. The legendary Duchess Celeste Ashbourne, respected by the kingdom but condemned by society, found herself cradled effortlessly against the chest of the most powerful young man in the realm. For a moment she simply stared at him. Tears shimmered in her eyes. His gaze never left hers. Then he spoke the words that would be remembered for generations. "You are not my mistake." The silence deepened. "You are not my sacrifice." A tear escaped down Celeste's cheek. "You are not too old." Her trembling hands gripped his shoulders. And then his voice softened. Not weaker. More powerful. Because every person present could hear the truth inside it. "You are my everything." The ballroom erupted. Shock swept through the crowd like wildfire. Some nobles looked horrified. Others appeared stunned. Several young women who had spent months pursuing Alexander seemed unable to believe what they had witnessed. Yet Alexander remained completely unmoved. He set Celeste gently back upon her feet. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt truly seen. Not admired. Not respected. Not pitied. The realization shattered something inside her. Years of grief. Years of insecurity. Years spent believing life had already chosen her ending. All of it began falling away. Alexander reached into his coat and removed a folded document bearing the royal seal. The crowd gradually quieted again. Everyone assumed they knew what was coming. A formal engagement announcement. A political declaration. Perhaps even a royal scandal. No one expected the truth. "I have one more announcement." The room waited. Alexander unfolded the document. "As of tonight, I decline the office of Lord Protector." The reaction was immediate. Chaos erupted. Voices rose throughout the ballroom. Several politicians looked physically ill. One elderly duke nearly dropped his cane. The king himself appeared stunned. For years the kingdom had believed Alexander's greatest ambition was power. Now he was abandoning it willingly. Celeste stared at him in disbelief. "What are you doing?" she whispered. He smiled. "Choosing." The noise continued swelling. Alexander raised a hand. Gradually silence returned. "The position was never my dream." His words echoed clearly through the hall. Service was. Confusion spread across countless faces. Then Alexander revealed the secret he had protected for years. "There is something I built long before this title was offered." Curiosity replaced outrage. "What is it?" someone called. Alexander's smile widened. "The House of Second Springs." The name rippled through the ballroom. Most had never heard it before. Alexander continued. For years I have quietly used my fortune to establish homes, schools, and sanctuaries throughout the kingdom. The crowd listened carefully. For widows abandoned by society. His gaze found Celeste. For women told their lives were over. Emotion tightened his voice. For children with nowhere left to go. Murmurs spread throughout the hall. Then he delivered the final revelation. The founder and protector of that work will be Duchess Celeste Ashbourne. The ballroom doors opened. No one had been prepared for what followed. Hundreds of people entered. Women, children, families. Some carried white roses. Others carried simple bouquets gathered from countryside fields. They filled the edges of the ballroom. Many wore modest clothing. None possessed noble titles. Yet gratitude illuminated every face. One elderly widow stepped forward first. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Duchess Ashbourne paid for my home when I lost everything. Another woman followed. She funded the school that educated my daughters. A young mother approached carrying a child. She saved us. Then another came. And another. And another. The procession continued. Each carried a story. Each carried proof of lives changed through quiet acts of kindness. Acts Celeste herself barely remembered. For years she had given without recognition. Helped without expecting gratitude. Loved without seeking reward. Now those forgotten kindnesses returned all at once. She wept openly. Not from sadness. From understanding. Her entire life she had feared growing old. Feared becoming irrelevant. Feared losing value. Yet standing in that ballroom surrounded by lives she had touched, she finally saw the truth. She had never been fading. She had been becoming. Months later, spring transformed the countryside into a sea of blossoms. The House of Second Springs flourished beyond anyone's expectations. Gardens bloomed across its grounds. Children raced through flower-lined paths. Women rebuilt lives they once believed lost forever. Laughter filled spaces that had once known only despair. At the center of it all stood a garden chapel covered in climbing white roses. No crowns adorned the ceremony. No political banners flew overhead. No throne waited nearby. Only friends, families, widows, children, and love. Alexander stood beneath an archway woven with flowers. When Celeste walked toward him, sunlight illuminated her face. She looked radiant. Not despite her years. Because of them. Every joy, every sorrow, every sacrifice, every lesson. They had shaped the extraordinary woman approaching him now. When their hands joined, the gathered crowd erupted into applause. The ceremony passed like a beautiful dream. Promises were exchanged. Vows were spoken. Tears and laughter blended together. At its conclusion, hundreds of children released thousands of white roses into the sky. Petals drifted across the gardens like snowfall. Alexander drew Celeste close. Together they watched the flowers rise toward the clouds. No kingdom had been lost. Something better had been found. The kingdom remembered Alexander Whitmore as a great duke. But history remembered Celeste Ashbourne as the woman who taught an entire kingdom that love does not belong to the young, it belongs to the brave.